the idea so that he can claim that it's all rooted in white supremacy, that it was created to be colonial. This is a bullshit argument made from lies and laziness.
Boy, did I ever make that guy mad. Sorry. So a little bit of background here. Seth Andrews of The Thinking Atheist reached out to me to do an interview after he saw a lecture of mine online. I had given a talk in Evansville, Indiana about the intellectual ancestry of ancient aliens. And I kind of went through how ideas and claims about ancient aliens are, kind of transposed from claims about Atlantis and where those ideas get started in the modern era in the late 1800s, and how they're connected to colonialism and imperialism and that sort of thing. So this guy took great offense that I would point out that the search for Atlantis has racist roots. It most certainly does. So I watched his video and I took some notes, and I have some notes, and I'll go through them and make a few comments. I'm not going to do an hour-long, scripted rebuttal of somebody else's scripted trashing of me or whatever. That's nonsense. But I will make a few points. So one issue here is the definition of science and pseudoscience. I give a pretty clear definition of what I think pseudoscience is, and it's non-science pretending to be science. And one of the main things that is different is there is no mechanism for throwing out bad ideas. So I think that this guy, I think his name is Dan, one of the mistakes that he makes, I think, is conflating a false result in a scientific endeavor with pseudoscience. So he gives all these examples like, well, these things that we used to think were right or wrong, so are those all pseudoscience? And the answer is no, they are not. And actually figuring out that things are wrong is one of the hallmarks of science. That's what we try to do. We try to winnow away ideas that are wrong. So, the development of scientific thought and knowledge about the natural world is littered with ideas that have been discarded because they are wrong. That's the nature of it. That's what you do. So pointing to everything that, we were wrong about in the past and saying, does that make it pseudoscience? Well, the answer is no, that doesn't make it pseudoscience. But the reason we're still talking about stupid ideas about Atlantis and lost civilizations and things like that is because there isn't a mechanism in pseudoscience for throwing out those ideas. So you can go, you can look at a lot of the people who are talking about Atlantis and lost civilizations these days, and you can find the exact same train of thought almost to the letter as was put forth by Ignatius Donnelley in, when was that written? 1882. To me, that lack of changing is one of the hallmarks of pseudoscience. It doesn't mean that everything that doesn't change is pseudoscience either. We're talking about a process, not the result. So it's important to separate those two things, which that distinction of separating process from result did not come across well in what he was saying. So I don't know whether he understands it or not, or he was just trying to score points or whatever. But that's the difference. I think it's important to clearly define your terms. I have defined mine. I think I know what pseudoscience is, and I know what science is. I've been doing science for decades now, so I kind of get it. It's the best I can do on that one, I'm afraid. You can lead a horse to water, I suppose. All right, comment number 2. One of the things that really seemed to get underneath his bonnet is that I didn't talk about the kind of pre-Ignatius Donnelley Atlantis people like Augustus Le Plongeon, who said that, the Maya went to Atlantis and then to Egypt or whatever. And he said they weren't racist, or they weren't as racist as Donnelley. So therefore I was being somehow intellectually dishonest by leaving them out. I don't know whether any of you have ever been interviewed, but somebody wants to talk about a topic. You agree, and then they ask the questions, and you have a conversation, and you try to address the questions. The question was not which people talked about Atlantis that were not racist. The idea was, what are the kind of sinister undertones of this intellectual ancestry of ancient aliens and Atlantis and things like that? So I was focusing on the more racist ones. And I think everybody acknowledges that Ignatius Donnelley is the quote unquote, father of modern Atlantis theory. You can strip away some of the particulars in his book, and you could publish it today, and it would not look that different from a lot of what we are hearing out there in terms of, these things all look alike. They have to have a common descent and ancestry. Here's geographically what Atlantis was like. Here's kind of what we think about the technology. All that stuff was in there in 1882. His kind of philosophical underpinnings in writing this book are absolutely racist to the core. Let me find a good quote from Donnelley here. Page 133. Let's see. I cannot believe that the great inventions were duplicated spontaneously, as some would have us believe, in different countries. There is no truth in the theory that men pressed by necessity will always hit upon the same invention to relieve their wants. If this were so, all savages would have invented the boomerang. All savages would possess pottery, bows and arrows, slings, tents, and canoes. In short, all races would have risen to civilization, for certainly the comforts of life are as agreeable to one people as another. And here we go. Civilization is not communicable to all. Many savage tribes are incapable of it. There are two great divisions of mankind, the civilized and the savage, and, as we shall show, every civilized race in the world has had something of civilization from the earliest ages. And, as all roads lead to Rome, so all the converging lines of civilization lead to Atlantis. The abyss between the civilized man and the savage is simply incalculable. It represents not alone a difference in arts and methods of life, but in the mental constitution, the instincts, and the predisposition of the soul. Ladies and gentlemen, that is as racist as it gets. As racist as it gets. The abyss between the civilized man and the savage is simply incalculable. He's saying there is a fundamental split in humanity. Some peoples are capable of civilization and some are not. Therefore, if there is evidence of a civilization, then that means those people were civilized, and that means that they must be connected to other civilized people. So when you go around the world and you look at ruins of past civilizations, he makes the logical leap that the people living there now, if they were capable of civilization, they would have it. But since they're not capable of civilization, they don't have it. And therefore, the civilizations that are there do not belong to them. They must belong to some other ancestry. That is an absolutely racist idea that is absolutely fundamental to Donnelley's argument that Atlantis must have existed, and here is the evidence for it, and here is why we can interpret that evidence that way. If you can't see that, I don't know what to tell you. It doesn't matter who came before him. It doesn't matter whether Augustus Le Plongeon ever said anything like that. This is what Donnelley said. And this is what I was talking about. And like, there it is. Explain to me how that is not racist. And if you just look at the arguments for Atlantis today, you will see a lot of this same kind of logic in it, period. As well as in the arguments for ancient aliens. So you can be an apologist for these guys all you want, but that's racist. And if you're looking for this stuff and you're using this formula to do it, you need to understand that that's where it comes from. And actually, what is kind of submerged in Donnelley's ideas about what the evidence for Atlantis should look like and why is the idea of hyper-diffusionism, which Dan in his video says that I don't remember what he said. I got that terribly wrong or whatever. It's not that old of an idea. It was in the 1960s. If you look it up, I'll look it up for you. Hyper-diffusionism is a pseudo-archaeological hypothesis that postulates that certain historical technologies or ideas were developed by a single people or civilization then spread to other cultures. And here the first picture they have up is Grafton Elliott Smith's map of hyperdiffusion from Egypt, 1929. Now, last time I checked my calendar, 1929 is actually significantly before the 1960s, but I think that you can push this idea farther back. It may not have been called hyperdiffusionism until 1929 or later, but that's the idea, and it's been around for a long time. And it was pretty much fundamentally embedded in Ignatius Donnelley's take on Atlantis and how we would recognize it and why we would expect things to be the way they are. And it, of course, has a through line through a lot of the racist archaeology and anthropology of the Nazis and so on, right up into today, into today's ancient aliens and ancient lost civilization stuff. So there you go. You're clearly wrong about that one. What else? Oh, all these weird analogies about because so many other people in the 1800s were racist and therefore is... You know, he brought up Susan B. Anthony and medical doctors and the Tuskegee experiment. And he's like, well, if all these things are racist, then, you know, is anybody fighting for women's suffrage now or doing medicine now also racist? Completely misses the point. Actually, you're helping to make my argument by pointing out that racism was the dominant worldview of most white Europeans and most white Americans in the 1800s. It was everywhere. It was part and parcel of the way the world was, and especially with European colonialism, it was basic to it. So yeah, I don't think you could throw a stone in the United States in the mid 1800s or in Europe and not hit a flaming racist. But does that kind of endemic racism have an equal relevance to all the different branches of science? And I would argue that no, that it actually has a particular importance when you are talking about using it as pieces of the puzzle and evidence and an entire paradigm like Donnelley does. Then yes, it has a lot more importance than, what if Susan B. Anthony were a flaming racist? Does that have anything to do with the women's suffrage movement? Maybe it does. You can make that connection to me. I'm sure willing to listen. But what about Michael Faraday, who was working on electricity and magnetism? Was he a racist? I don't know. Chances are he probably was. Does it have anything to do with his theories of electricity and magnetism? I really doubt it. I really doubt it. In the history of medicine, however, does it matter that doctors and clinicians were doing racially unjust experiments? Yeah, I think it matters. If I were a doctor today, I would hope that I learned about that in my education, that I learned about the social and cultural past of my profession. And I'll tell you what, archaeology and anthropology started off, at least in the United States, absolutely embedded in the racial thinking and the racial narratives. Morton's Crania Americana. Samuel Morton is known as one of the fathers of American physical anthropology. Total racist. Some of his work, which now actually is labeled as pseudoscience when people have looked at his methods, and again, it's the process, not the results, was done specifically to justify inequalities among the various quote unquote races. Looking at correlations between brain size and intelligence and trying to make that argument. Absolutely racist as hell. Early archaeology, both in the United States and in Europe, and social Darwinism and things like that. Yeah, these were absolutely racially based, and they were embedded in what was going on with European colonialism and imperialism. Plain and simple. And guess what? If you get a good education in anthropology and as an undergrad or a graduate student, we talk about that stuff because it's important to know where your profession comes from. It doesn't mean that the questions we are asking now are racist because there were racists in the past, but you better understand how your discipline developed and you better know where you come from. You do. If you think you can take cues from Ignatius Donnelley, but stick your head in the sand and say it doesn't matter whether he was racist or not, you are absolutely wrong. It absolutely does. Racism underpins the entire framework of his inquiries and thought about Atlantis. You're asking the same questions for the same reasons. So when you just blow it off and say, yeah, everyone back then was racist, so what? We're moved on now. You're completely ignoring kind of the weight of that baggage. And in fact, you're willingly picking it up and carrying it, and you don't even realize you're carrying it. And that lens is what helps make it pseudoscience. You guys are so attached to this idea that these similarities in pyramids and statues and everything are most easily or perhaps only explainable within this hyper-diffusionistic paradigm of things flowing from higher, more sophisticated people having to have a direct historical connection and actually be the same people. And it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And the only reason I can think of why people would buy into that is that they're also buying into Ignatius Donnelley's paradigm that, these quote unquote savage people couldn't have built that stuff, which is an absolutely racist idea to its core. So if you decide that you can go on and study all of these things and just leave all that aside and not think about it because everybody used to be racist, I got news for you. The world doesn't work that way. Okay, what else? At some point he was talking about racism and early Egyptology and Flinders Petrie, and I don't remember the specifics. But I think what he was trying to say was that, my claim that early Egyptology had a strong element of racism in it was somehow wrong. So, the Egyptians depicted people with different colors of skin and different kinds of hair. And the mid-1800s racists made a lot of hay out of this. Josiah Nott, who is a famous American polygenist and defender of slavery and friend of Samuel Morton, said that those Egyptian depictions of quote unquote different races, showed that the races had existed for a very long time, and that therefore were created separately. But so trying to attribute the fantastic things about ancient Egypt to the quote unquote Caucasians in the mix was a very common pastime. Samuel Morton and Josiah Knott did it. Flinders Petrie with his dynastic race. If you want some evidence, sure, this is not the kind of thing that I would bring up in an interview like that, but here you go. Here's a 1844 speech, I think. 2 lectures on the natural history of the Caucasian and Negro races by Josiah Knott, 1844. I already found the page, and let's go back to it, page 16. The conclusion to my mind is irresistible that the civilization of Egypt is attributable to these Caucasian heads. They had been looking at a bunch of skulls and decided that some of them were Caucasian, and therefore those must have been the builders of ancient Egypt, or the rulers of ancient Egypt, or whatever. Because civilization does not now, and never has, as far as we know from history, been carried to this perfection by any other race than the Caucasian. How can any reasoning mind come to any other conclusion? You want to tell me there was not racial thinking and studies of ancient Egypt? Keep talking. What else? Oh yeah, and this weird thing about content. He didn't like, or he didn't like that I make videos about stuff other than things he's interested in, I guess. It's my channel. I'll talk about whatever I want to. My YouTube channel is a hobby, one of many hobbies that have come and gone and ebbed and flowed for me over the course of my life. I've been doing archaeology professionally for some 30 years now. I talk about the real human past in my professional life. This stuff with messing around with you guys who want to find giants in Atlantis and whatever, sometimes that has been part of my professional world. When I was in South Carolina, I taught a class in it for 3 years. I wrote a blog for a long time, starting about 10 years ago, and I put it down over the last few years, but I've looked into this stuff quite a bit. But in terms of like what's on my channel, I'll put whatever I want to on my channel. If you don't like it now, just wait till I start talking about my art and my music, because it's coming. If I want to talk about it, I'll talk about it. Anyway, I only speak for myself. I speak for me. That's it. I don't speak for any students that I've had, any mentors that I've had, any places that I have worked or studied. This is my channel, and I speak for myself. Oh, circling back to the point again about archaeology and anthropology having racist roots and having done racist things. I think we know that. And I'm not going to shy away from that. I think the history of our profession is important to understand. I've been doing this, like I said, for 30 years. So I started in the early 90s. Very transitional time for American archaeology, with the passage of NAGPRA and kind of the changing of the guard. Talk about a nuanced conversation, like the conversation about how archaeology has changed, what the past has to do with the present in our discipline, and so on. Like that's a conversation to have at the adult table. And people like this who just yammer on for an hour trying to score points and misrepresent things and intentionally misunderstand things, or maybe it's not intentional. I don't know. But that's not the place to have that conversation. And I think there are probably a lot of serious conversations still to come in archaeology and anthropology about how our profession has handled things in the past and what we need to do now and in the future to try to be on a different path. And again, that's a serious, nuanced conversation, not to be had with a bunch of hand waving with somebody on YouTube. And I guess in closing, I'll just say that, at this point in my life, like I think I know something about how to make sense of the past. That's my training, my profession, my livelihood. I think I'm okay at it, or even good at it in some respects. And I also think I can, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can look into the future. And my knowledge and training and instinct tell me that 10 years from now, we are going to know more about the past than we know now, because science is going to continue to work. But 10 years from now, we will also have, maybe there'll be a different technology for doing it, but it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be the same thing since Ignatius Donnelley and Ancient Aliens and Graham Hancock's latest books. It's going to be the same mystery mongering, the same questions about who built the pyramids and where Atlantis is, and, trying to still find these gaps to make money off clicks, sell books. Some of you guys are going to be gone, and some of you guys are going to be yammering on about the exact same things you are now, with no difference. No difference. And it's because you're not embracing the real search for the past. You're just doing what you're doing. And I guess you're going to do you. And in my spare time, I'm going to call you on it. And I'm going to continue to talk about the intellectual ancestry of these ideas. And I know when it makes people upset like this, that I have hit the mark because they don't want to hear it. And I know that I make myself a target when I put my head up and say, hey, listen, it's not all fun and games. Getting the human past right is important, and you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to get the right answer if you are still sticking to that paradigm that was summarized by Ignatius Donnelley and Josiah Nott, that some people are just not capable of civilization, and that's how we can recognize the presence of Caucasians or Atlanteans or aliens or whatever. It's all dips out of the same big tank of racist baloney. So you can, ruffle your feathers and strut around and say that it's woke or whatever you want to do, but it's the truth. It's the history, and it's there, and you can go read it for yourself and try to understand it. You guys can keep on trying to sell the mystery. I will be here doing my thing when I have time. Like I said, this is a hobby, so this is an evening and weekend pursuit for me. I'm not going to make a ton of really fancy edited videos on some kind of schedule, and I'm not going to have thousands and thousands of followers and all this kind of garbage. So you do you, and I'm going to continue to focus on the things that are important and point out some of the dumb crap that you say and do, and talk about the history of it, which is interesting. So I guess that's all I wanted to say about that. Bye-bye.